Margaret had been
Oh
working at the palace for
my
23
god.
years. 23 years of walking the same corridors, checking the same doors, protecting the same family that she had never really spoken to. She was 51 years old now, and her back hurt in the mornings, and her hands were not as steady as they used to be. But her mind was still sharp. Her eyes still saw everything, and her heart still cared, even though caring was not part of her job description. She had started this job when she was young and wanted to save the world. She wanted to be important. She wanted to protect people who mattered. The palace seemed like the place where that could happen. But over the years, Margaret had learned that being a guard meant being invisible. You were supposed to be there, but not noticed. You were supposed to see everything, but say nothing. You were supposed to care about people who did not know your name. Margaret had never married. She had never had children. The palace had become her whole life. The palace was her family, even though her family did not know she existed. On this cold Tuesday morning in autumn, Margaret arrived at work at 6 o'clock, just like she did every day. She drank her tea in the guard room. She read the night report. She walked her usual path through the East Wing corridor. Everything was the same as always. Everything was normal. And then, near the children's study, she saw something that made her heart stop. A door was closed. Not unusual. But this door, the bronze door to the secondary storage room, had something wrong with it. The lock. Margaret could see it from 20 feet away. The lock had been opened. Not broken by force, not damaged in a rough way. This lock had been opened carefully, professionally, by someone who knew what they were doing. Margaret walked very slowly to the door. She did not run. Running would have attracted attention. She moved like she was just doing her normal morning inspection. But inside her chest, her heart was beating very fast. When she touched the lock, she felt cold. The metal was cold, and her hands were cold, and she felt like she was the only person in the whole world who understood that something terrible had happened. Someone had been in this room. Someone had broken the most important rule of the palace. Someone had gotten inside where they were not supposed to be. Margaret stood there for 4 minutes. Just stood. She did not touch anything else. She did not open the door. She just stood and looked and felt the weight of what this meant. She had been a good guard, a careful guard, a guard who noticed things, and she had not noticed this. How was that possible? She walked to the telephone on the small table outside the nursery. Her hands were shaking a little bit, but she held them steady. She picked up the phone and made a call. "We have a problem," she said quietly. Her voice sounded calm, but she was not calm. She was scared. She was scared because she understood what this meant. Someone had broken into the palace. If she had not noticed the broken lock, what else had she missed? She did not know it yet, but in another part of the palace, 2 children were also awake. Charlotte could not sleep. She was 8 years old, and she had had a bad dream. In the dream, she was lost in the palace and could not find her way home. She had called for her parents, but nobody heard her. She had walked through endless hallways, and every door looked the same, and she was alone and scared. When she woke up, she was still scared. She went to her sister's room. Kate was 13 and thought she was grown up already. Kate was sitting by the window, reading a book. "I cannot sleep," Charlotte said. She sounded small. She sounded like a child who needed her big sister. Kate looked at her and felt that thing that older sisters feel. They need to protect. They need to make the world safe for someone you love. "Come on," Kate said. "Let's go for a walk. That always makes you feel better." So they put on their warm clothes and they walked out of their rooms. They walked through the corridors like they owned them, because technically they did. They were the palace children. This was their home. These corridors were as familiar to them as their own bedrooms. Charlotte held Kate's hand. They talked about things the way sisters do. Charlotte told Kate about her nightmare. Kate said that nightmares were just stories that our brain makes up, and they were not real. Kate said that she was there, and she would always keep Charlotte safe. "Even if I am scared?" Charlotte asked. "Even if you're scared," Kate said. "That is what big sisters do." They turned the corner onto the East Wing corridor. They saw Margaret standing very still in front of the bronze door. They knew Margaret. Margaret was the nice guard who sometimes gave them cookies from the kitchen when nobody was watching. Margaret had a sad face, but she had a kind heart. Margaret saw them, and something changed in her face. She turned around very fast. "Margaret, why is that door open?" Kate asked. She was curious. Kate was always curious about things. Margaret felt her chest get tight. She had been standing here thinking about the broken lock, and now the two children she had secretly watched grow up had seen it. Now, this secret was going to be part of their memory forever. "That door is not open," Margaret said. She tried to make her voice sound normal. "We were just checking the locks today, making sure everything is safe. You two should not be walking alone. Where are you going?" Charlotte moved closer to Kate. She felt something in the air. Even at 8 years old, even in her tired, scared state from the nightmare, she felt that something was wrong. "We were going to the library," Kate said. She was looking at the door. She had seen what Margaret was trying to hide. She was smart. She was too smart. Margaret knew she had to do something. She had to move these children away from this door. She had to keep them from thinking about what they had just seen. "Not this morning," Margaret said. She used a voice she used when she had to be strict. "This morning, I will walk you to the library myself. The corridor is being inspected today. You need to come with me." As they walked away, Margaret walked between them and the broken door. She walked like she was protecting something. And she was. She was protecting the palace's secrets. She was protecting the king's security. But she was also protecting these two children from knowing that their home, their safe place, had been broken into. That someone had gotten past her. That she had failed. Charlotte looked back once. She saw Margaret's face, and she saw something there that would stay with her for many years. She saw worry. She saw fear. She saw an adult who was trying very hard to keep something hidden. That night, Charlotte would ask Kate if she thought Margaret was okay. Kate would say that she did not know. They would never speak about the broken lock again, but they would remember it. They would remember the way Margaret's hands looked when she was trying to hide her worry. They would remember the moment when they understood that the palace, their beautiful, perfect palace, had secrets that nobody wanted them to know. And Margaret would go home that night to her small apartment, and she would sit in her chair, and she would cry. She would cry because she had missed something. She would cry because she knew that this small thing, this broken lock, was going to lead to something much bigger, something that would change everything. She did not know what it was yet, but her heart knew. Her heart told her that nothing would ever be quite the same after this day. Margaret did not sleep that night. She sat in her apartment in the dark, drinking cold tea, thinking about the broken lock. Her mind would not stop working. Her heart would not stop racing. Something had happened inside the palace, and she was the only one who truly understood what it meant. The responsibility felt like it was crushing her. By morning, the secondary storage room had been photographed and sealed. 6 more security guards were brought in, but Margaret gave them very few instructions. She told them to say nothing to anyone. She told them to look at the room and then forget what they had seen. She told them that this was official business that did not exist yet. The guards obeyed because Margaret was their leader, and she carried herself like someone who was carrying something very heavy. But inside, Margaret was falling apart. She had worked at this palace for 23 years. She had given everything to this job. She had missed her own mother's funeral because she could not leave her post. She had refused a marriage proposal from a man who was kind and good because she said the palace needed her more. She had made the palace her whole life, made protecting this institution her entire reason for existing. And now, on the morning after the worst night of her life, she was learning a terrible lesson. You can give everything to something and it can still break while you're watching. The storage room was supposed to be nothing important. Boxes of old papers, old ceremonies that no one remembered, files from decades ago. But Margaret knew, because she had helped organize this room years and years ago, that on the bottom shelf of the cabinet, there were things that mattered. Things the king wanted to keep hidden. Things that could hurt him if they became public. Margaret stood in that room alone for 6 hours. 6 long hours. She went through every file. She checked every box. She made notes of what she saw. And with each file she touched, she felt more scared. Because this room contained secrets. Real secrets. The kind that could shake the whole palace if they got out. She found herself shaking when she reached the sealed file. It was old and yellowed, and it had not been opened in 20 years. The file was marked with initials, which meant it belonged to something private. Something the king wanted to keep just for himself. Margaret looked at that sealed envelope for almost 5 minutes. She wondered what was inside it. She wondered if someone tried to open it. She wondered if her entire world was about to change. When she opened the file cabinet and looked inside, her heart nearly stopped. The file was still sealed. Thank God. Thank God it was still sealed. But someone had been here. Someone had looked at this file. Someone had considered opening it. And for some reason, they had decided not to. This scared Margaret more than if they had opened it. Because a thief would have taken it. A thief would have opened it. But someone had come to this room, had seen this file, and had decided to leave it alone. That meant someone inside the palace knew what was in this file. Someone inside knew what it meant. Margaret's hands were shaking so badly that she could barely hold the camera to take pictures of everything. She felt sick. She felt like she was going to cry. She felt like she had failed at the most important job of her life. Someone had gotten inside the palace. Someone had walked past her. Someone had broken into a room that she was supposed to be protecting, and she had not even known it was happening. She sat down on the floor of that cold room and let herself cry for 5 minutes. Just 5 minutes. She cried because she was scared. She cried because she was tired. She cried because the palace, the thing she loved more than anything, had been broken into under her watch. Then she stood up, dried her face, and became professional again. Because that is what you do when you have given your whole life to something. You do not get to break down. You do not get to fail. You stand up and you figure out what to do next. That afternoon, Margaret requested a private meeting with Sir Edmund Hayes. Sir Edmund was the chief of staff. He was the king's closest advisor. He was someone Margaret had worked with for 5 years, and in all that time, she had learned to trust him. He was a good man. He was someone who understood that protecting the king meant sometimes protecting secrets that were very hard to carry. Margaret sat in his office with the door locked. She had a single piece of paper in her hand. The paper had names on it. Names of people who had accessed the storage room in the past 3 months. 7 names. She handed the paper to Sir Edmund without speaking. He looked at the paper. He read the names slowly. And then, when he read the 4th name, something changed in his face. His breathing changed. His hands became very still. Margaret saw it all. She saw the moment when he understood that this was not just a security problem. This was something much worse. This person, Margaret said quietly, pointing to that 4th name, went into that room 2 times. Maybe 3 times. But they were not supposed to be authorized to go into that room. They're not supposed to have access to that door. Sir Edmund did not speak for a long time. He just looked at the name. His face became older, sadder. "Are you sure?" he asked finally. "I am sure," Margaret said. "I have checked everything 3 times. The security logs show that this person entered that room without proper authorization. Someone gave them access, or someone did not stop them from entering. Either way, someone inside this palace has compromised security." Sir Edmund stood up and walked to the window. He looked out at the gardens. The gardens were beautiful. The gardens did not know that something terrible had happened inside the palace. The gardens did not know that someone they trusted, someone who worked here, someone who was supposed to protect the king, had broken that trust. "We cannot tell the king yet," Sir Edmund said. "Do you understand what I am saying? We cannot go to him and tell him that his security has failed without knowing exactly what has happened. We cannot tell him that someone inside his own palace has betrayed him without knowing everything." Margaret understood. She understood that Sir Edmund was asking her to carry this secret. He was asking her to keep investigating without telling anyone else. He was asking her to be strong when she wanted to break down. "I understand," Margaret said. "I will find out what happened. I will find out who did this. And then we will tell the king the truth." As Margaret left his office, she felt the weight of the secret settle onto her shoulders. She was now carrying something that could destroy everything. She was now looking for a person she trusted, a person she worked with every day, and she had to assume that this person was a traitor. This person had stolen something. This person had broken the most important rule of the palace. Margaret walked through the corridors that evening, and she looked at every face she passed. Every guard, every staff member, every person who worked in the palace. She looked at them and she wondered, "Is it you? Are you the person who broke the lock? Are you the person who betrayed us?" And she realized, with a deep sadness in her heart, that she no longer felt safe in her own palace. The place she loved had become a place of secrets and lies, and she was the one who had to uncover the truth, no matter how much it hurt. After James confessed, the investigation became more focused. Margaret and Sir Edmund needed to find out who had contacted James, who had told him that stealing secrets was a good idea, who had promised him that he would finally matter. They had to narrow the list of suspects down to one person. The work took 3 days. 3 long days of looking at phone records, email messages, and surveillance footage. 3 days of checking who had met with James outside the palace. 3 days of trying to find the moment when James had been approached and tempted. And then they found it. A meeting between James and another person. A person who worked inside the palace. A person who had access to information. A person who had access to James. The person's name was David. David had worked at the palace for 8 years. Unlike James, David was not completely invisible. David had a position. David had some authority. But David was not where he thought he should be. David had been passed over for promotion 2 years ago. David had watched younger people with better connections move ahead of him. David had felt the weight of the palace's hierarchy crushing him every single day. When they brought David in for questioning, Margaret was surprised by how angry he looked. Not angry at being caught. Angry at the world. Angry at the palace. Angry at everything. "Why did you do this?" Sir Edmund asked. David laughed. It was a bitter laugh. It was the laugh of someone who had stopped caring about anything. "Because I was invisible," David said. "Just like James. Just like everyone who does not have the right last name, the right family, the right connections. We work here. We give our lives to this place. We show up every day and do our jobs perfectly. And nobody notices. Nobody cares. Nobody thinks we matter." David stood up from his chair. He was shaking with anger. "I went to university," he said. "I got good grades. I worked hard. I started working here when I was young and full of hope. I thought that if I was good at my job, if I was loyal, if I did everything right, then I would move up. Then I would matter. Then someone would notice me. But they did not. Year after year, I watched people who were less qualified than me, people who had just the right family or the right connections, move into positions I should have had. And I realized something. I realized that no matter how hard I worked, I would never be good enough for this place. This place only values people who were born into value." Margaret felt something heavy settle in her chest as she listened. She understood what David was saying. She understood it because she had felt something similar her whole life. She had given everything to the palace, and the palace had never given anything back except the privilege of being invisible. "So you decided to betray the king?" Sir Edmund asked. "I decided to take power," David said. "I decided to do something that would make people notice me. I decided that if I could not move up through hard work and loyalty, then I would move up by having information that someone wanted. I contacted foreign interests. I told them that I could get them documents that would embarrass the king. I told them that if they paid me enough, I could change policy by forcing the crown to negotiate from a position of weakness." "And James? Why did you involve James?" "Because James had access to the storage room," David said. "And because James was desperate. James wanted someone to see him. James wanted someone to say that he mattered. I gave him that. I said his name. I said he was important. I said he could help me do something that would change history. And he believed me." Margaret left the room. She could not listen to any more. She walked to the bathroom and locked herself in a stall and cried. She cried because she understood. She understood that David was right. She understood that the palace had created this situation. The palace had made people invisible. The palace had valued bloodline over loyalty. The palace had taken good people and told them, year after year, that they were not good enough. And when David and James finally broke, they did not break because they were bad people. They broke because they were human beings who could not bear to be invisible anymore. Margaret washed her face and walked back to Sir Edmund's office. She did not feel like a security officer anymore. She felt like she was part of something terrible. She felt like she had been complicit in a system that crushed people and then acted surprised when they finally fought back. "What happens now?" she asked Sir Edmund. Sir Edmund looked very tired. He looked like a man who was beginning to understand something about the palace that he did not want to know. "Now we report this to the king," Sir Edmund said. We tell him that his security has been compromised. We tell him that someone inside his own palace has stolen his secrets. We tell him that two men betrayed him because they felt invisible and undervalued. And what do you think the king will do? Margaret asked. I do not know, Sir Edmund said. I do not know anymore what anyone will do. I thought I understood this place. I thought I understood how it worked. But I do not think I understand anything anymore. Over the next week, more facts came out. David had indeed made contact with foreign governments. David had indeed copied documents. David had indeed planned to sell secrets about the king's old political position, secrets that would have damaged the crown's international reputation. The plot had been real. The threat had been serious. But what struck Margaret most was not the details of the conspiracy. What struck her was the moment when they found David's apartment. Because in his apartment, they found something unexpected. They found journals. Dozens of journals. Years of journals where David had written about his dreams and his hopes and his disappointments. They found pages and pages of words about how hard he had tried and how much he had wanted to be seen and valued. Margaret read some of those journals. She should not have. It was not part of the investigation, but she read them anyway. And in those pages, she found David's humanity. She found a young man who had come to the palace with hope. A young man who had believed in the institution. A young man who had slowly been broken by the weight of being invisible. One entry from 2 years ago said, I will never be promoted. I know this now. I can see it in the way they look at me. I can see it in how they talk to other people. I'm not one of them. I will never be one of them. So what is the point of being loyal to a place? That does not want me. Margaret sat in the security office and held that journal and felt something break inside her. Because she understood that David was right. And she understood that she had been part of the system that had broken him. She had worked for 23 years for a palace that did not value people like David. People like James. People like her. She thought about Kate and Charlotte, the children she had protected. She thought about how they would grow up in this palace. She thought about what this place would teach them about who mattered and who did not. And Margaret made a decision. She would report to the king. She would tell him the truth. But she would also tell him something else. She would tell him that the palace had sickness. And the sickness was not just David's betrayal. The sickness was the system that had created the conditions for his betrayal. She did not know if the king would listen. She did not know if anything would change. But she knew that she could not stay silent anymore. She had been silent for 23 years. And silence, she was finally beginning to understand, was a form of betrayal too. The king stood in the secure room with Margaret and Sir Edmund for almost an hour without speaking. He looked at the photographs of the broken lock. He read David's journals. He studied the surveillance footage. He understood, slowly and painfully, what had happened inside his own palace. And what hurt him most was not the betrayal. It was the understanding that he had created the conditions for this betrayal to happen. The king was a good man. He had spent his whole life trying to do the right thing. He had tried to be a good father to his children. He had tried to be a good leader. He had tried to care about the people who served him. But looking at David's journals, looking at the words of a young man whose hope had slowly turned to despair, the king realized that trying was not enough. Good intentions were not enough. How many people feel like this? The king asked Margaret. His voice was quiet. He sounded tired. Margaret did not answer immediately. She was thinking about all the years she had worked at the palace, all the faces she had seen, all the people she had never really noticed because they were not important enough to notice. I do not know, Margaret said finally, but I think there are many. The king nodded slowly. He understood. He understood that somewhere in his palace, there were probably hundreds of people who felt invisible. Hundreds of people who had worked hard and been loyal and been passed over. Hundreds of people who had dreams that would never come true because they did not have the right last name. What happens to James and David? The king asked. They will be arrested, Sir Edmund said. They will face the law. They will go to prison. But the documents have already been copied. The information is already in the hands of foreign governments. The damage has been done, and we could do nothing to undo it. The king sat down. He looked like a man who was carrying a very heavy weight. No, the king said finally. We can do something. We can change how this place works. We can make sure that what happened to David and James never happens again. Over the next 2 weeks, the palace was very quiet. The arrest of David and James was kept secret. To the outside world, nothing had happened. But inside the palace, everything was changing. The king had made a decision. He had decided that the system of invisibility had to end. He created new positions. He opened pathways for people who wanted to advance based on merit, not just family connections. He ordered reviews of all staff to ensure that people were being treated fairly. He made changes to salaries and benefits. He made changes to how promotions were decided. These were small changes, perhaps, but they were real changes. And most importantly, he made one more change. He hired a new director of staff development, someone whose job it was to make sure that no one in the palace ever felt completely invisible again. Someone whose job it was to check in with workers, to listen to them, to value them. Margaret was offered the position, but she refused. She said she was too old. She said her heart was too tired. But what she really meant was that she could not bear to stay in the palace anymore, not after everything she had learned about herself and the system she had helped create. Instead, Margaret requested a transfer to a smaller palace, a quieter place where she could finish her career in peace. The king granted her request. He also gave her a letter. In the letter, he thanked her for everything she had done. He told her that her honesty had saved his institution from destroying itself. He told her that she was not invisible to him. He told her that she mattered. Margaret cried when she read that letter. She cried because it was the first time in 23 years that anyone had told her that she mattered. On her last day at the main palace, Margaret walked through the corridors one last time. She looked at the East Wing corridor where she had discovered the broken lock. She looked at the secondary storage room, which now had a new lock and new security protocols. She looked at the library where Kate and Charlotte had been that morning when their world changed. She thought about David and James, who were now in prison. She thought about how they had wanted to matter so badly that they had destroyed their own lives trying to prove that they were important. She thought about how the palace had pushed them to that breaking point. But she also thought about the changes. She thought about the young people who would now have a better chance to advance. She thought about the workers who would now have someone to listen to them. She thought about how the palace, slowly and imperfectly, was trying to become better. The king had also done something else. He had visited James and David in prison. He had talked to them. He had told them that he understood how the palace had failed them. He had told them that it was not their fault, not entirely. He had told them that he was trying to change the system that had broken them. This did not erase what they had done, but it meant something. It meant that the king had finally seen them. Kate and Charlotte never really understood what had happened that morning in the East Wing corridor. They had asked Margaret about the broken lock several times, but Margaret had never given them a complete answer. Some secrets, she believed, were too heavy for children to carry. But the children grew up knowing that something important had happened. They grew up understanding that institutions could be broken and that broken things could sometimes be fixed. Years later, when Kate was older, she would read about the minor scandal that had briefly threatened the crown's reputation. She would read about the documents that had been stolen, about the security breach, about the 2 men who had been arrested. And she would remember that morning when she and Charlotte had seen Margaret standing very still before a broken lock. She would remember the fear in Margaret's eyes. She would remember understanding, for the first time, that the world was more complicated than she had thought. On Margaret's very last day, she stood outside the palace gates. She had worked there for 23 years. She had given everything. And as she walked away, she felt something strange. She felt sad, but she also felt, for the first time in a long time, like maybe she mattered too. She had told the truth when it was hard. She had spoken to power when it would have been easier to stay silent. She had looked at the broken lock and followed where it led, even though it led to places that were dark and difficult. She had helped her institution understand itself better, even though it hurt. The palace would never be perfect. The system would never be completely fair, but it will be a little bit better. It will be a little bit less cruel. And somewhere inside, a young worker would feel slightly more seen, slightly more valued, slightly less like they were completely invisible. As Margaret walked away from the palace, she thought about David's journals. She thought about all the young people who were just beginning their careers, full of hope like David had been. She hoped that they would not have to wait as long as David had. She hoped that they would feel noticed earlier. She hoped that someone would tell them that they mattered before they broke. And she understood, finally, that her 23 years of service had not been wasted. They had led her to this moment. They had led her to understand what needed to change. They had led her to finally speak the truth. And maybe, just maybe, that truth would save someone else from becoming invisible. The palace doors closed behind her, and Margaret, for the first time in decades, felt like she could breathe.